Let's begin here. Protesters are encouraging fired federal workers, veterans, Ukraine supporters, Democrats, disillusioned Republicans, all to come out to protest the government's handling of the country. It comes amid the Department of Government's efficiency firing of thousands of workers, the shutdown of the international development programs, and increased fears of a recession as the trade war ramps up. Let's get more details now. We speak to SABC News correspondent Nick Harper, who is in Washington and joining us live now. Nick, good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time. So, when the president, the U.S. president that is, was addressing Congress, we heard from some of the protesters who were angry about the situation in Ukraine. But one would say, given what we've seen then and just shortly before then and now, it seems these protests are gaining some momentum.
Yeah, absolutely, Bongi. As you can see, there's plenty of action here on the National Mall just in front of the US Capitol. We're a little way away from the protest. It's very noisy down there. But we're seeing people gathering this Friday lunchtime really to protest, as you mentioned, a whole range of issues. Now, this protest was organised by a veterans group, people who've served in the US military, but are now seeing either their jobs cuts or their benefits cut. And they have organised this, but it is becoming a rallying call for people with a whole range of issues that they feel the government is mishandling. And top of the list seems to be those DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, job cuts. And there have now been tens of thousands in the less than 2 months that Donald Trump has been running the country and back in the White House. Much of the anger, of course, directed at the person who's at the top of that newly created department, the billionaire Elon Musk. We've seen plenty of people streaming past us here today with Elon Musk signs saying that he has to go, because there is a real fear that with that cost cutting, with that efficiency drive from the US government, it could lead to a destabilization of the government. Quite simply, not enough people to run the departments that are being cut. And we've also seen the huge reduction, almost complete stoppage of the International Development Agency, USAID, that's affected funding for hundreds of programs right around the world, including on the African continent. Donald Trump, of course, referenced many of those in that speech in front of Congress just in the last week or so. So plenty of people here today, probably already in excess of 1,000. They're expecting about 3,000 to be down here during the course of the day. But certainly we are seeing growing momentum in this protest movement right across the United States.
And Nick, we've seen even some reports suggesting that the Vice President, J.D. Vance, lost his cool with some of the protesters in recent days. What has been the response from other government officials?
Yeah, it's very interesting, because if you think back to the last time that Donald Trump was in the White House, there were many more protests right at the beginning of his presidency. We saw more than 1 million people out here on the streets of the US Capitol. But over the last 8 weeks, there has been less in the way of protests. Protests outside of government buildings where people have been losing their jobs. But there has been a slow, bubbling resentment that is building into bigger protests like the one seen today. J.D. Vance, the Vice President, he was attending a musical concert at the Kennedy Center about 1.5 miles from where I'm standing. He was there last night. Some of the people who were also in the audience to watch were booing him. He was not particularly happy. He has on several other occasions, while he's been with his children, even out on the ski slopes in the northeastern part of the United States, been attacked by protesters who've been shouting things at him. We've seen other similar scenes with Republicans in particular who've been holding town hall events with their constituents right across the country. Many of the constituents standing up, shouting at those elected officials and really demanding answers for why we are seeing such an enormous cost-cutting drive with quite simply so many people losing their jobs. So there is that backlash. But like I say, it seems to be slowly building in a very different way than we saw during Trump's first administration.
Quite interesting. And one wonders what, Elon Musk, as some continue to blame him as far as DOGE is concerned, what has he said to all of this, and also given his own turmoil at Tesla, as we've seen in recent days?
Well, yes, and he is very unhappy about what he has seen taking place in Tesla. There, they've seen the share price in the company drop in an enormous way, as have many other technology companies been severely affected during the downturn over the last few weeks. About $5 trillion worth of share value has fallen off the markets in the last 3 weeks alone. Now, a lot of that is driven by recession fears, a real concern that with the tariffs being put in place by the Trump administration, the US may see a recession further down the line. In terms of Elon Musk, he has spoken in interviews about his despair in seeing the share price drop, seeing the value of his company drop. There has been that real worry from him. He hasn't spoken out publicly against the protests, but he has continued to maintain that the work that he is doing as part of Doge and the cost-cutting efforts, he says all of that is needed because, quite simply, he and Donald Trump feel there has been too much wastage in Washington for many, many years, and this is their chance to try and prune that back and cut the jobs that they feel are quite simply unnecessary.
Right, Nick, thank you so much for that update. Appreciate it. That's SABC News correspondent Nick Harper in Washington for us as those protests that seem to be, against how government has been handling several issues in the country are seemingly gaining momentum. So certainly we'll continue to bring you more on that story.